Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to Talking Tudors, episode 48. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Before we jump into this week's episode, I'd like to thank the wonderful patrons who continue to support this podcast. I'm so grateful for your encouragement and generosity. You can find a full list of patrons on my website under the Patrons tab. If you love Talking Tudors and would like to show your appreciation and support the work I do, just click on the Be My Patron on Podbean badge on the homepage of my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, or click on the Be a Patron button on the Podbean app. Join the Talking Tudors patron family and you'll be automatically entered into our patron-only monthly giveaways. September's prize is a digital download of the album Elizabeth by Carleen, inspired by the life of Elizabeth I. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the show to talk about the Knollys and Carey families is Dr Kristin Bundesen. Kristin holds a PhD in Elizabethan social and political history from the University of Nottingham. She's senior faculty for the humanities at Walden University, subject matter expert for popular culture, and has been honoured with the Centre for Faculty Excellence Award for Teaching, Scholarship and Service. She maintains an active research agenda, presenting, lecturing and publishing for both academic and lay audiences. She was a New Mexico Scholar of Record for the First Folio, the book that gave us Shakespeare exhibit, funded by the Folger Shakespeare Library, and founding board member for the International Shakespeare Centre. Recent presentation topics include non-royal 16th century biography, Margaret Douglas, Elizabeth's two acting companies, and the adaptation of Outlander for television. My conversation with Kristin straight after this short musical break, courtesy of guitarist Jon Sayles. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Kristin. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's lovely to be chatting with you today. So I thought we could begin by you introducing yourself to our listeners and telling them just a little bit about your background and yourself.
Well, I have what in academia is called a transdisciplinary background, but in the rest of the world it's called eclectic. I have had a variety of careers, and I was an assistant to a movie star. I had a clothing store. I modeled. I spent a decade in IT and ran a performing arts school for a few years. And then when my kids grew up and went to college, I went back to college, and I earned my doctorate at the University of Nottingham. And now I work as faculty and an administrator, sort of an odd combination. And I work for Walden University, which is a wholly online university with about 50,000 students worldwide. And I'm senior faculty in the humanities for undergraduate education. And I'm the subject matter expert for popular culture, which means I get to binge Netflix and call it research.
That's really great. Very handy.
Yeah.
All right, that sounds like a really interesting and varied career that you've had there. Really interesting. So when did your interest in the Tudor period in particular begin?
A long time ago, when I was 17 or thereabouts, the BBC, which in the United States was airing as Masterpiece Theater on public television, had the Elizabeth R series with Glenda Jackson and the Six Wives series with Keith Mitchell as Henry VIII. And I got hooked then and there. I think I was most interested in the costumes to begin with, to be fair. But then for my 17th birthday, my mother gave me 17 books about the Tudor period, including some very weighty tomes about Tudor government and all nonfiction and very intimidating. But oddly, I still own them. So that was the beginning.
That was the beginning. Yeah, that's a great series, actually, that one that you mentioned. I know that's that sort of sparked a lot of people's interest in this period of history because it's such a good show. Now, you've spent quite a lot of time researching the prominent Elizabethan family of Sir Francis Knollys. Talk to us a little bit about his background and his family and how he came to serve several Tudor monarchs, I believe.
Yeah, well, I researched the Carey Knowles clan, and so I researched the other Boleyn girls' descendants, right. Catherine and Henry Carey. So Sir Francis Knowles marries Catherine Carey. So that's how I got into researching the Knowles group. So it pretty much dates from his marriage to Catherine Carey. But Sir Francis was the son of Robert Knowles and Letitia Knowles. And Robert, his dad, was an usher of the Privy Chamber under Henry VIII. So they were a court family. And I think one of the most romantic tidbits is that Robert Knowles was granted the manor and church of Rotherfield Grays by letter patent under Henry VIII for the annual rent of one red rose on Midsummer Day.
Oh, I'd never heard of that. That's a fantastic story.
It's supposed to have been presented formally on Midsummer Day on the bridge over the river in Reading, but I don't think that happened frequently because they weren't often in Reading. But still then, under Henry VIII in 1534, Francis started serving in Parliament, and he was appointed as a gentleman pensioner in the royal household. And then when Henry died, Francis served Henry's son, Edward VI, as Master of the Horse, which is a very intimate position, physically touching the monarch to help them on and off their horse and accompanying them everywhere that they went by horse. And he was a Justice of the Peace. Francis seems to have been under Protector Somerset's patronage a bit. He fought at the Battle of Pinkie Cleugh, where he was knighted by Somerset. So the good news is, though, that Francis' relationship with Edward, the young king, was stronger than his one with Somerset. So he survived the clearing out of the Seymour brothers, which was great. But then under Mary Tudor, Francis Knowles was a reformer, fairly staunch reformer, so he became a Marian exile under Mary and left England to go to the continent.
Okay, that's a fascinating career there already. And that's interesting that you mentioned just the physical intimacy of the position, because I was just thinking, of course, Robert Dudley popped into my head, thinking that he was master. Right. Thinking of that, very handy for him to be Master of the Horse for Elizabeth.
Very handy. You can get your hands all the way up the calf, you know?
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Now, you mentioned that Sir Francis Knowles married Catherine Carey, and if any of our listeners are wondering, so that's Mary Boleyn's daughter, and so that made her obviously a cousin to Elizabeth I. And over the years, as I'm sure you've come across lots of times, there have been questions raised about the paternity of Mary Boleyn's children, so Catherine and her brother Henry Carey. So the official line is that they're the children of Mary and her first husband, William Carey, who died in 1528. However, at around that time, and Tudor history is never straightforward, Mary is, one of Henry's mistresses, Henry VIII, that is. So could you tell us, what are your thoughts on this whole paternity case of the Carey children?
Well, I believe they're the king's children.
Right.
They're not William Carey's children. Just cutting to the chase there. It is a slightly contentious issue, and you're right. The traditional line is that they are Carey children, not semi-royal children, not half-Tudor. But I believe they're half-Tudor. And some of the reasons that very eminent historians give for why Catherine and Henry Carey were not half-Tudor don't seem to make that much sense to me. For example, Eric Ives, who has that wonderful, wonderful and definitive work on Anne Boleyn, says that Henry VIII couldn't have been the father because he had fertility issues. But actually, Henry didn't have low fertility issues. He had no problem getting people pregnant. He just had a problem in having male children live to maturity. Catherine of Aragon was pregnant 6 times. Elizabeth Blount had a healthy pregnancy, giving birth to his acknowledged bastard, Henry Fitzroy. Anne Boleyn was pregnant multiple times. Jane Seymour was pregnant within the year of her marriage to the king. So impregnation was not the issue. Just carrying male children to term was the issue. Mary did not get pregnant after the birth of Henry Carey in 1526, so the second of the Carey children. And she didn't get pregnant by her husband after that, and she got pregnant once with her second husband, Stafford, but that child also does not seem to have lived for very long because we've lost them in the archives. But even more compelling to me is the timing of some significant gifts to William and Mary Carey, including the naming of the ship, Mary Boleyn. I mean, King Henry VIII names a ship after Mary Boleyn in 1523 when she's pregnant with Catherine Carey. Why would he name a ship after this person? So there's a whole spate of royal grants to Mary Boleyn's husband, William Carey, in 1522, 23, 24, 25, manors and estates, and just like tons of stuff on this, and including the royal grant that includes the borough of Buckingham. So it's sort of impossible not to be struck by the coincidence of this gift just 12 days before the birth of Henry Carey, a male child. And actually, the person who's done a lot of work on this is Anthony Hoskins, who's a genealogist who is descended from the Carey clan. But he's done some really good research on this. And then just the more I delve into it, I'm pretty confident that they are half-Tudor. But everyone can believe whatever they want, and if you're more comfortable considering them cousins instead of half-siblings, I'm good with that.
Yeah, it's an intriguing mystery, isn't it? And the more you delve into it, the more you wonder. And I know portraits, were not always made to reflect what the person exactly looked like, but I think Catherine's portrait, she looks quite Tudor in that portrait of Catherine Carey.
Yeah, the portraits are quite something. I also think just as long as Henry VIII was alive, he was quite benevolent to Henry and Catherine Carey, and there was really no reason for him to take a benign interest in them. For example, Catherine Carey becomes a maid of honor in advance of the arrival of Anne of Cleves. So she's part of the assemblage that goes to meet the Cleves bride, Henry VIII's next wife. There's no reason necessarily. She wasn't from a powerful family. She wasn't from a rich family. She was related to Anne Boleyn that he beheaded. Why would he bother? There was plenty of other people vying for those positions. And then once Catherine Carey married Francis Knowles, again, Henry was quite kind to them. He went to some trouble bringing 2 acts through Parliament to confirm the ownership or the possession of Rotherfield Grays for the couple. Why bother if he didn't have some sort of affection there? So I'm pretty convinced.
And what's your sort of theory, I suppose, on why he didn't, he acknowledged Henry Fitzroy, his son by Elizabeth Blunt. Why would he not have done the same? Is it because obviously he went on to be with Anne? Is that, what you're thinking there?
Partly, yes. I mean, when Henry Fitzroy, the son of Betsy Blount, was born, Mary is just beginning to emerge, possibly catch the king's eye. And then the first child's a girl, so there's no point in getting another illegitimate female heir. That's sort of worthless to the king, who's obsessed with this male heir issue. And then by the time Mary is pregnant with Henry Carey and Henry Carey is born, the king has shifted over to Anne. And you can't really divorce your first wife by claiming that she was your brother's wife, and so it's within the prohibited degree. If you acknowledge the children of the sister of the woman you want to marry, it's like the same argument repeating itself.
Yeah.
And so it would be wise for him to avoid that. It would also, the hopes were so high between Anne and Henry. I mean, she essentially promised him a male heir, that if there were other illegitimate male heirs, they would threaten Anne's children by the king. So it's just wiser to keep them all in the background.
That's very interesting. All right, so Francis and Catherine married. How did that match come about? Were their families connected already?
That's not really clear to me, but Francis was on that same trip to the coast to welcome Anne of Cleves.
Right, okay.
And odd things can happen on the road. And Mary Boleyn, Carey Stafford now, she was married to Stafford at that point, was still alive when Francis and Catherine married. So she may have, I'm presuming she supported the match. But there is a significant age difference. He was 29 and Catherine was 16. And shortly after their marriage, Francis is appointed as a gentleman pensioner within the court. So again, I'm not sure. The other problem is that I've read Adrienne Dillard's book Coroto,
yes.
and which is a wonderful novel, right? She has fictionalized their meeting and their courtship, and so that got sort of stuck in my head. And it's perfectly fine. Sure, they're on the road together and they decide to get married, or they fall in love and they work it out. But the king would have had to know about that marriage, and he would have had to at least not oppose it if they were both in court under his patronage, essentially.
I'd love, Kristin, to hear more about the very large Knowles and Carey family. So they went on to have 14 children, and I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the roles that those children ended up playing at the court of Elizabeth I.
It's interesting because you sort of can't turn around without tripping over one of them.
Right.
And when I first started researching the family during my doctoral research, my supervisor said, "I don't know who these people are. What are you talking about? Who are they?" And then it turns out there's 103 of them alive.
Gosh.
Between 1558 and 1603.
Wow.
So, they're everywhere. It's just that we don't seem to have a huge personalized cache of archival documents like we have Cecil's papers. So we think Cecil was very important because we have a lot of information about him. We don't have a family repository of documents for the Carey Knowles clan, but there are a ton of them. So it's quite a big block. Now, the history of Parliament says that one half of the family was the largest parliamentary block. And Wallace McCaffrey, also an eminent Tudor historian, says that the other half of the family was the largest parliamentary block. So there's no doubt that when you add the Carey and the Knowles together, and you've got 14 to 20 odd people in Parliament at once, that's a voting bloc. And Sir Francis Knowles runs Parliament for the Queen, essentially. She says, go get this through Parliament. It's Francis's problem to make sure that the bill's read and that it comes to a vote and that the desired outcome is eventually reached. So they have a huge effect in the few parliaments that Elizabeth had during her reign. One of the standouts is Catherine Carey Howard. So this would be Henry Carey's daughter, Catherine, who marries Charles Howard, Baron Effingham, later Earl of Nottingham. And they became an Elizabethan power couple. I used to liken them to Brangelina, but now that Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie have broken up, I'm beginning to think of them as George and Amal Clooney. Catherine Carey participated in Elizabeth's coronation and the celebrations as a maid of the court, and she continued in Elizabeth's service until her death just a month before Elizabeth in 1603. And her husband, Charles Howard, was the Lord High Admiral and on the Privy Council. And when Queen Elizabeth refused to get into bed as she was in her decline, a few days before her death, the court called Charles Howard out of mourning to come and get Elizabeth to get into bed. So he's the commander of singeing the King of Spain's beard and Cadiz, along with Essex, who's there as more of a petulant nephew. Then he's in command during the Armada. He's, pretty much everywhere throughout the reign, and so is Catherine Carey Howard. Then there's Lettice Knowles, Francis and Catherine's daughter Lettice, who's probably the best well-known of the daughters because she marries first Walter Devereux, Earl of Essex, and secondarily the Queen's great favorite, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, making her a double countess.
Yeah.
And while the Queen forgave Robert Dudley, she never forgave Lettice for marrying Robert. So Lettice is a whole project in and of herself. I should mention, because somebody asked me prior to my talking with you, what happened to two of the Knowles daughters. There's a Mary Knowles and a Maud Knowles.
Okay.
And unfortunately, Mary seems to have disappeared from the archives, and actually so does Maud, but we do have some evidence that Maud was placed in the Duchess of Suffolk's household. The Duchess of Suffolk had the highest ranking aristocratic reformed household during Mary Tudor's reign.
Right.
And it would have been a perfect place to foster out daughters for their finishing school training on how to run an aristocratic or gentry estate. So Maud went to the Duchess of Suffolk for sure. It's possible Mary was there too, but we're not sure. The boys were great privateers. They fought in wars. The Knowles and Carey cousins pretty much always fought together. If you found a Knowles, there was a Carey nearby. And so they were together in Ireland fighting. They were on the Anglo-Scots border fighting. They were in the Low Countries fighting. And Henry Knowles, so this is a son of Catherine and Sir Francis Knowles, was in command of 3 ships under Humphrey Gilbert, and they were off to discover lands not claimed by other Christian princes under permission from Queen Elizabeth. But a couple days out, he defected, took his ships with him, and went and snagged prize ships off of the coast of Spain and Portugal, and would bring them back to Plymouth and Southampton, and then he would unload the goods, but he would never pay the Queen's customs.
Right.
He would just unload them and then take them on his cart to one of the Knowles properties. And what's interesting is there's a record in one of the state papers of the customs officers stopping the wagon train of riches being carted off, saying, well, you haven't paid the Queen, you have to stop. And then finding out that it was a Knowles and saying, oh, never mind. We'll back off. I love, there's a story of Thomas Knowles, also a son of Sir Francis and Catherine, and his cousin Thomas Morgan abducting 2 daughters, sisters, of the Marchioness of Bergen-op-Zoom and marrying them. And this sparked an international row that had the girl's mother, the Marchioness, sending warships after them and filing suit in The Hague. And Queen Elizabeth just had their back and wrote the Marchioness saying, why don't you be happy for them? They have happy marriages. So the Marotta girls, their story later was that they asked to be abducted because they were going to be forced to marry some Spanish Catholic guys and they didn't want to be Catholic. So, Anne Knowles left, later Baroness de la Ware. She had 3 sons who are governors of American colonies. The state of Delaware is named after them. She was taken into the Queen's household quite young on Catherine Carey's death And in the first year, the Queen gifted her 50 pairs of shoes.
Wow. That's quite a gift.
Yeah, very unusual. And I also like Elizabeth Knowles-Leighton. She's another daughter that was around for all of Elizabeth's reign. She was 9 years old when she was granted livery for the coronation. And she was 28 when she married Thomas Leighton, who was finally knighted after his marriage into the clan. And she was there when Elizabeth died, and the Queen was her godmother. And I think that Elizabeth Knowles-Leighton is a really interesting woman. She writes a lot to the Court of Admiralty, swaying decisions to go in favor of her interests. They're quite an unusual group, and for most of the part, they've been under the radar of traditional historians.
Yeah, it's so many fascinating stories. I'm just thinking you could really lose yourself in some really deep rabbit holes researching all those people and their connections. And it's nice. It's also nice to think, obviously Elizabeth didn't have her mum from very young, but it's nice to think that she was surrounded by the sounds of it, a lot of family. So that's a
lot of family,
really nice.
And participated in a lot of normal family things, like going to weddings and giving gifts at christenings and showing up at christenings and paying for funerals and helping organize apprenticeships, if you will. So we have this image of Elizabeth I as all alone, solitary, the last virgin queen, or the last Tudor, the virgin queen, and yet there's 100 non-royal cousins hanging about. So
yeah, that's really nice. Makes it more human, I suppose. Makes them all more human. That's great. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Knowles Funeral Monument, which is in St Nicholas Church in Rotherfield Grays, and you've mentioned that place a couple of times already in Oxfordshire. Could you tell us a little bit about that monument?
It's fairly declarative. It was built by William Knowles, a son of Francis and Catherine, and it is meant to establish the family as rising through the aristocratic or the elite ranks, because by the time that it's built, William has become a Viscount. He's adds this canopy over the top with him and his second wife, whose name was Elizabeth Howard, and was 20 years old when she married William, who was 60, so we don't even need to think about that. but very grandiose canopy with all of their robes and coronets on it. But the part that is at eye level is in the parish church, which is walking distance from the Rotherfield Grays Manor, and it's sort of in a side chapel. It takes up pretty much the whole side chapel. You can walk all the way around it. Catherine and Sir Francis are laid out on top, looking up, full body with their icon, their badges at their feet. So Sir Francis has an elephant and Catherine has a swan with a coronet around the neck. And then on one side there are 7 female weepers next to Catherine, and on Sir Francis's side there are 7 male weepers. So these are statues of their children who they can call upon to pray for them or weep. And on Catherine's side, there is a small effigy lying next to her of an infant, swaddled. So it's really a fascinating bit of iconography, if you will, for the family. The coat of arms are engraved in various locations. William Knowles goes to town on the canopy portion with all sorts of badges and shields and indicating how important he is, which is fine. And this was then, as you may have figured out, built during James I's reign. So Elizabeth I has died, and we're in the Jacobean early days. So it's a pretty interesting effigy and monument. I've been to see it twice. They no longer let you through the gate to walk around it because it's become worn down. And certainly there has been some vandalism in the past combined with the vandalism of age. So the first female weeper is got a countess's coronet on her head, which makes identification of her easy. That would be Lettice. She's the only daughter who qualified for a countess's coronet and would have taken precedence because of that. So she's first. But the balls are broken off and there's some noses missing and some chips, some damage.
Yeah.
And so in order to protect it and preserve it, they've pretty much cut it off to visitors. You can still view it from Catherine Carey's side, from Catherine's side, as she's closest to the congregation area, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm going to definitely add that to my list now. Next time I'm in that area, have a look at that. So how is it that Catherine's effigy helped confirm the identity of a sit-in portrait attributed to Stephen van der Meulen, which is thought to depict Catherine Carey? And I did read some of your work online, and there's a connection there. Can you explain that to us?
Yes, one day I went down a rabbit hole.
Yes.
And easy to do.
Yeah.
This portrait is relatively rare type of portrait in that it's a pregnancy portrait. It's a portrait of a woman who is in her last trimester, likely. And it's titled possibly Catherine Carey Knowles. It's held at the Yale Museum of British Art, in Yale, Connecticut, in the United States. But aside from physical characteristics of the shape of the face, which I'm frankly pretty bad at using for confirmation, the most compelling piece of evidence is the necklace that she's wearing in the portrait and on the effigy. It is the same necklace. So that necklace would not have been put on the effigy if it wasn't hers. And it's very unique that the pendant says, "I seek but that content with thee." So this is either a testament to her religious devotion or more likely her feelings towards her husband. But the pendant's in both locations, and that's not something that gets passed around.
Well, that's pretty good proof, if you ask me, if it's the same necklace. Yeah, that's pretty compelling,
yeah.
I think.
I'd love it if Yale would rename the portrait, but they're not going to. So.
Oh, really? Right. I have a feeling that I saw it. I think I went there when I was in the States last year. I'm just trying to think. Yeah. So I've seen so many different portraits and things that they're all kind of getting a bit mixed. So you mentioned that in the portrait, the sit-down is pregnant, very visibly pregnant. Mm-hmm. And I know that you've said that it's likely that the unborn baby was Catherine and Francis's last child, Dudley Knowles. And I suppose just by the name Dudley, when I just saw Dudley, I thought male. But so most people have assumed that it was a male child, but you actually suggest that Dudley was in fact a girl. So could you talk to us about how you came to this fascinating conclusion?
Sure. Well, it was a Saturday night. And I settled into the sofa with a big bowl of pasta to read the Elizabethan gift rolls, as one does on a Saturday night.
We all do that on a Saturday night. That's how I spent my weekend.
And I came across a reference in the Elizabethan gift rolls of Queen Elizabeth giving a christening gift to Sir Francis Knowles for a daughter that had been recently born. And Jane Lawson, who edited the Elizabethan gift rolls and has done an amazing job with this sort of detail work. She's so good at it. So I wrote her, there I am with my pasta, writing her saying, "Jane, do I have the dates right? Or is this new style, old style? Is this the year, because the calendars didn't match up and, the Gregorian calendar and all that stuff has led to some odd dating through the centuries." And she confirmed and checked her source, which was the actual gift roll, and said, "No, it's a daughter." And I had a moment of, it has to be a girl. Dudley is listed in Sir Francis Knowles' dictionary, and that must be a girl. And then I remembered that there were girls named with family names, like Douglas Howard, right? She's female. She was female. I use the present tense. You can tell I live in the 16th century in my head. Douglas Howard, there's even a woman, an elite woman, whose first name was Essex. So it wasn't unusual for women to have a family name as a first name. It's just our gendered assumptions throughout the centuries have presumed that it was a boy and that it was placed in effigy on the funeral monument next to its mum because she would nurture it, and how sweet and romantic and sentimental and nostalgic, none of which is true. Dudley, the effigy of the infant, is on the mother's side because it was a girl. The entire monument is a key to understanding that because all the girls are on one side and all the boys are on the other side. And if Dudley had been a boy, that effigy would have been next to Sir Francis on the other side of the monument. I'm pretty convinced, and then Jane said I should write that up. Jane Lawson said I should write it up, and I invited her to write it up with me because it was both of our research. And we're both convinced, I don't think I'm talking out of school to speak for Jane on this, that Dudley is female, and it's just our gendered sensibilities that said, oh, must be a boy.
Yeah, it's such a good reminder not to assume things. It's so easy to just make those assumptions. So Catherine appears pregnant in the portrait, as we've said. So, yes. And the timing is right for it to have been the birth of Dudley. Is that right, for the baby to have been Dudley?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Dudley is the last pregnancy Catherine Carey had that we know about. And we know about all of her live births because Sir Francis wrote it down in the Latin dictionary for us with weird details, like at 2 a.m, the 6th day after Easter, like right. Real details. And the previous pregnancy was far enough away that it puts the portrait out of whack date-wise. So I'm pretty confident it's Dudley she's pregnant with in that portrait. And as the last child, it would have been something that would have occurred, is to take a portrait, like a picture, to, in case something goes wrong in the birth, at least my portrait's been painted and we know. So it seems, and now that I know that I've put this together, it seems quite obvious to me, but I understand that's just me.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about Catherine Carey and her cousin Elizabeth. What was their relationship like?
It was very close. I mean, it's as close as we can determine it to be from the surviving archival sources. Probably the most famous bit, of course, would be the letter that Elizabeth wrote to her cousin / half-sister, Catherine, that's signed Cor Roto, or broken-hearted. And this is a letter from 1553, which appears to have been written upon the Princess Elizabeth receiving the news that Catherine Carey Knowles was going to the continent to escape Mary Tudor's reign and to join her husband, who was already there. And between them, they had 5 of their children with them on the continent as Marian exiles. So there's that broken-hearted bit. It also means that we know that Catherine Carey Knowles spoke Latin. Spoke Italian. We also know that when Catherine Carey Knowles passed away quite suddenly, actually, at court. I mean, she had been ill, but it was unexpected. Elizabeth went into a depression that was commented on by ambassadors. And the Queen paid for Catherine Carey Knowles' funeral, and the hearse so elaborate that the heralds and Westminster Abbey fought over it, and the Duke of Norfolk had to step in as Earl Marshal to adjudicate because the cloths were so rich and there were so many jewels sewn onto this hearse to carry her body to Westminster Abbey. And then, of course, there's the idea that she's buried in Westminster Abbey, not in Reading, not someplace else, but in this central national or kingdom-centric location.
And I wanted to talk more about the monument to Catherine that survives on the wall of St Edmund's Chapel in Westminster Abbey, because just to confuse matters a little bit more, the inscription records that she had 16 children, which of course differs to the funeral monument that you've talked to us about in St Nicholas Church. So why do you think the discrepancy between these two?
Yeah, there's a typo in Westminster Abbey. That I think the discrepancy was a misunderstanding or a transcription error of the English language.
Right.
Pretty much. I mean, Sir Francis was quoted as saying, "I have 6 sons living besides my eldest." Okay, so that would be a total of 7, right?
7,
so but if you don't have the comma in the right place, or you read it quickly, you might think he has 7 plus 1 or some other configuration. So I think I think it's a typo. It just got mistranscribed, translated somewhere along the line and carved into a plaque, which was moved in the 1960s from one location to another as they were accommodating more plaques and burials within the Abbey. But the thing about the 14 is that we have now Sir Francis Knowles' Latin Dictionary, which was a huge find, which happened while I was doing my doctoral research. And I was not the one to find it. The house steward at Rotherfield Graves was. Apparently it was the house was being lived in by the last owners of the estate. But there had already been plans in place to give it to the trust, to turn it into a trust property. So there was a house steward there from the Heritage Trust to start inventorying and do,
Yep.
getting things in order and documenting all the stuff. The Latin dictionary was on the night table in the master bedroom under a bottle of Diet Coke.
Oh, goodness me. Oh, I love those stories. They really give me hope. They give me hope that there's so much more out there, on people's nightstands.
So now the dictionary has been gifted to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, so it'll be properly conserved. But in that, because Francis Knowles was so detailed, he records every single birth. So we know it's 14 because there are 14 records.
Yeah, 14 records.
So that's going to be my definitive answer and not the plaque in Westminster Abbey.
Yeah, and so with the 16, they... if there was an error, and they thought, okay, maybe 8 boys, it was known that they had the same number of girls and boys. Is that how they came to just double it and come up with 16?
Sorry, I skipped over that bit. Yeah.
No, it's okay.
Because it was the same number of girls and boys. So if he had 8 boys, there must have been 8 girls. But now we know he had 7 boys and 7 girls, especially now that we know that Dudley is a girl and that there was no Cecilia Knowles, which was a fabrication of, that's an 18th century fiction that arrived. 14, not 16, even number of boys and girls.
Love that. I love getting things clarified. And I was just thinking, it was so wonderful, the detail that Sir Francis Knowles recorded of the births. If only all the other Tudor fathers had done the same, we wouldn't be having so many issues about birth dates and, all that sort of stuff.
And if the dictionaries hadn't been ruined by Diet Coke, right? Like if we had those books, they recorded it and they survived. And it turns out that Henry Carey did write down most of the births of his children, but in a Froissart's Chronicles, which is held at the British Library. It's in a leaf between volumes. It's pretty intriguing, but it's not a complete list. So, and Henry Carey really wasn't one to write things down.
Intriguing, fascinating stuff. So you've talked a little bit, you've mentioned Lettice, which was Francis and Catherine's daughter that married Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, making Elizabeth very unhappy, in 1578, after Walter Devereux, her first husband, had died. So were the Knowles and the Dudley families closely connected before this match was arranged?
Quite closely connected, actually. Not only did they know each other from court service, which would have been hard to miss, right? If we've got several Knowles men serving, Sir Francis Knowles was Vice Chamberlain of the Queen's household. He's on the Privy Council. There were sons who were gentlemen pensioners. They were in the military. Dudley was very military focused. They knew each other well from time at court. But there's also another piece of it. Most Tudor aficionados and fans know that William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, took in many wards and fostered many young men, and in the hopes of training them up to be great servants to the state, to be good government officials, to know the right languages, to know how to keep records, to know the right people, to be well-traveled and well-educated. Robert Dudley did the same thing, but for military skills. He had lots of fosters and young, sons of elites in his household that he took with him on military expeditions. And there's records of them playing cards and borrowing money to pay debts and gaming with each other. And so there's a quite close connection. And Robert Dudley referred to the Carey Knowles clan, or kinship network to be more academic, as the tribe of Dan. And he warned people to be careful of the tribe of Dan. Now, the tribe of Dan was the largest of the 12 tribes of Israel, and were descended from a handmaid, not the wife, just like Mary Boleyn was the handmaid to Catherine of Aragon, right? She was a lady in waiting. And that they were numerous, that they did lots of work for the tribe, as a tribe of Israel, they were everywhere. And so the Carey and Knowles tribe was everywhere. And Dudley was always very careful to make sure that he had at least some of the Carey Knowles kinship involved in whatever he was doing, because it was sort of like an immune booster if Elizabeth got mad. Right. He could go to Sir Francis Knowles and say, talk to her, or to more likely to all of the women who were serving in Elizabeth's court and say, talk to her. So they were close. And actually, at one point I was talking about this with Simon Adams, who spends a lot of time researching Robert Dudley. And he hadn't quite put together that the people witnessing Lettice's marriage to Robert Dudley were her two brothers. And because he was thinking Lettice Devereux and forgotten that her birth name was Knowles. And there's Richard Knowles as a witness to the marriage, and another Knowles brother, plus her father, who made them get married again because he wanted to make sure it was all legal. So there's quite a long history between the clan and Dudley.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, all those connections. Just, my mind's trying to keep track of them all, and it's very difficult.
Well, and even Henry Carey, I know we're looking at the Knowleses, but Henry Carey served Robert Dudley's father, John Dudley, Viscount Lisle, during Edward's reign. And so they were, fighting together and family friends, at court. Hard to miss.
Hard to miss, it sounds like that. Now I can understand why so many people write to me to say that they're descended from Mary Boleyn. I can kind of understand.
There's so many of them. And Henry Carey and Anne Morgan Carey, his wife, right, they had 12 children with maturity. Gosh. So lots of them.
So now that makes sense. I was kind of like, how can everyone be descended from Mary Boleyn? But now I'm thinking, it's possible now with all those children and people in the family. This has been so fantastic. I think I could talk to you forever, but we better start wrapping up, I think, Kristin. Okay. So we're up to the point where we play our little game of 10 to go. So these are 10 questions to get to know you a little bit better. So are you ready?
Sure.
All right. So name 2 items that are on your bucket list.
Living in Scotland for at least a year, and publishing more books than I have years left to live.
There's always so many book ideas. I know. I think the same thing. I think I need to live to like 150 to get them all done. What was the last film that you watched?
I think I watched for the second time the Brexit movie on HBO with Benedict Cumberbatch playing Dominic Cummings. I think I got lost in the news one day and said, I don't understand this. Let's go for the fictionalized version and maybe I'll get it.
Maybe it'll become a bit clearer. I don't know. All right. So what's a favorite childhood memory of yours?
So for a while when I was quite young, we lived in Laguna Beach, California, and about once a month we went to this very fancy restaurant for Sunday brunch. And got dressed up and went, and I would always order the French toast, which came, with powdered sugar, maple syrup, and whipped cream, and probably chocolate sauce. I mean, it was just a sugar rush. But on top of that, I got to order a Shirley Temple, and it came in a cocktail glass, and it felt very grown up and sophisticated.
Oh, that's a lovely memory. I love that. So, what do you do to relax and unwind?
I look at pictures of my grandchildren.
Oh, that's lovely. That would be very, very relaxing. What's a book that you're currently reading?
Well, I tend to read like 6 or 7 books at a time, and I leave them in various rooms so that when I stop, I can, if I stop in this room, there's a book I can read several pages of. And lately I've taken to reading on my iPad on Kindle, and I was just reading, what was I reading? Something about Elizabethan piracy, but I've also been listening on audible.com to John Guy's biography of Elizabeth I later reign. I tend to stick to the 1558 to 1603 time period.
All right, excellent. Some good ideas there. What's a favorite holiday destination?
My bed.
Hey, you sound like me. I love my bed.
I will just get under my duvet and be there forever with some streaming media and some books and cups of tea. And, if the children and grandchildren are around, I hope that one of them will come jump on my bed and say, Granny, get up and make me something. But I travel quite a bit, and I've lived a lot of different places, so not moving around is always nice. Yeah, although this Christmas, I'm throwing this in. This Christmas, I'll actually be in New Zealand.
Oh, because closer to me.
Yeah, my daughter's just moved to New Zealand, and she's going to have twins.
Oh,
so I'll be there for the birth.
Oh, that's lovely. And whereabouts in New Zealand are they?
They're in Matakana, just north of Auckland.
Oh, okay, lovely. I love New Zealand. It's beautiful. what is a favourite comfort food? I think you mentioned something before, so I'm thinking I might know this.
I don't know. Well, if I were Empress of the Universe, everyone would be required to stop at 3:00 and have a piece of cake and some tea, and I think the world would be a nicer place. But I will say that one of my favorite meals ever is a chicken enchilada from La Choza in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I've lived in Santa Fe on and off for most of my life. And every time we go back there, the very first meal we can go to La Choza, we have chicken enchiladas.
Yum, I love a good chicken enchilada. So if you could travel back to Tudor history to see one event or one sort of period, specific period, what would it be?
You know, at the moment, I mean, this changes all the time, but at the moment, I would say I'd love to hang out with Catherine Carey Howard, Baroness Effingham, while Charles is off on the Armada, because he sent her letters, which then she passed to Cecil. So she was the first point of contact, so it would be like the first news flash,
right?
News alert would be in her house. I'd like to hang out with her while Charles was off on the ocean, because she was the connecting tissue for that.
So if you could instantaneously have a new skill, what would it be?
Excellent paleography.
Yes, that would be so handy, wouldn't it?
I so struggle with this, and for your listeners who may not know, which is hard to believe because your listeners are pretty amazing.
They are pretty
Paleography
amazing.
is the skill of being able to translate the handwriting from ancient times or the 16th century into something that's recognizable as English today. And seeing as there were no spelling rules to speak of, and people spelled a lot of things phonetically, and punctuation was variable, and just the way they drew the letters, some of them bear absolutely no resemblance to the letters that we type on our computers today. I would love to have, get hit by a lightning bolt and suddenly be able to read all of those letters.
Yeah, wouldn't that be so good? I was just having a look. I normally I've got a list of the abbreviations used. I've got a list of, the different alphabet, the different letters, and try and work it out like that. But I just recently read a letter from Henry Fitzroy, actually written to his dad to thank him for a gift that he'd sent him for Christmas. He was only 9 or 10 at the time, so it's this, juvenile kind of beautifully neat and easy to read. And I was like, yes, I can read this without struggling, compared to some other handwriting that you just think, what is going on here? So I was very pleased to come across that one. Thank you, Henry Fitzroy. Lucky last, what's a really great piece of advice that you've been given at some point that you're willing to share with us?
A good piece of advice that I rarely follow myself. How's that? And that piece of advice is, it's not the end of the world. Whatever went wrong, it's only that. And I got this actually from a prima ballerina when I ran a performing arts high school. She was the last of the baby Balanchine ballerinas from New York City Ballet. We called her the Pink Barracuda, the top of her game. And at one point, some student fell apart and burst into tears. And she said, "We're not solving world hunger. It's only ballet." And I went, "Oh, right." No matter how frustrated you get, you're not solving world hunger. And if you are, please let me know and I'll advertise it. But if you're not, then just take a breath, go outside, fold the laundry, do something else.
So true, and such good advice. I know sometimes we need to get our perspective back, don't we, on certain things. So I love that. That's great. Now, the very last thing that we like to do on Talking Tudors, I always invite my guests to give us a Tudor takeaway. So something that our listeners and all of us can go and explore after the episode. Could be a website, a song, a movie to watch. Do you have a Tudor takeaway?
I do. I would recommend the Folger Shakespeare Library's Folgerpedia. They have on there something called the Elizabethan Court Day by Day. And it is an assemblage of multiple sources. So the processions and progresses of Queen Elizabeth, the calendar, state papers, diaries, account books, all sorts of different sources, which are great, but they are put together in year by year, day by day order so that you can follow the court. And you know when the ambassador showed up, and then when the queen took off and who was hunting when, and it doesn't have every single day because we don't have sources for every single day, but it has a lot of the day-to-day life. And it was put together by Marian Calthorpe, and it's freely available on the Folger Library website, and it's just oodles of fun. And there's a big thick appendix with all the women in the court, and another one with gifts, and so you can sort of get excerpts of things that you yourself are interested in. But just to have that put together in advance for you, it's like this wonderfully detailed timeline of the Elizabethan court.
That is absolutely right up my alley, because I love to know where the court is, and I'm obsessed with knowing where the court is at different times. And it's so funny that you mentioned this today, because I actually can't believe that I'd never heard of it, and I only just came across it yesterday, I think it was, on Twitter, when the lovely Dr. Joanne Paul tweeted something about it, and I thought,
oh, really?
Yeah, that was just yesterday, and I had a look,
wow.
And I couldn't believe that I'd never come across that before. I tend to write my own sort of itineraries for the court in terms of where they were for Henry's reign. And I would love if there was something like that for Henry's reign, but then that is an amazing resource. I just had a quick look through, and I thought, again, I could get lost for days in there, so best just to note down the link and move on to what I need to get done.
I know, it's bookmarked under 3 different folders and 3 different browsers on my computer.
Yeah,
so I can always find it.
But
it's not that hard to find, but
it's
lovely to use.
Yeah, and I'll add the link. Thank you. I know you sent me a link, so I'm going to add that to the show notes, so our listeners can just go straight onto the show notes and click on the link and then save that fantastic resource, because that's fantastic information. So that's a great takeaway. Thank you so much, Kristin.
You're welcome.
And thank you very much for taking the time out of your evening to talk Tudors with me.
I'm thrilled. I'll talk Tudors anytime.
Yeah, exactly like me. Well, you have a lovely evening. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you will also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and click on the all-important follow button so you'll never miss an episode. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.